The Image of Sin, Success Runs in Our Rates is a book written by George Fraser talking about how to network with not only black business leaders, but also white business leaders. He's a networking genius. Today we're going to talk about relying on white philanthropy or creating our own resources. The opening of the Tri-State Bank in 1947 did not represent a renewal of entrepreneurial spirit. Regrettably, the former drive and indomitable will was being redirected elsewhere as blacks turned away from the business initiation. During this period, black newspapers reported on business meetings and conventions where speakers tried to paint a rosy picture of the future. However, the prospect for black business was not a rosy one. In spite of optimistic rhetoric by the diehard faithful, it was clear that the momentum for economic development was waning. Something else was becoming clear. Of two prevailing but opposite points of view that once vied for the allegiance of black, one was fading into the past with memories of the Depression, and one was emerging and taking firm hold. In the life of a man like George W. Lee of Memphis, we get to focus on these two powerful forces that once battled for the attention and even loyalty of the black masses. During the 1920s, Lee was among those who emphasized group consciousness and economics as a necessity for winning economic independence from whites, a philosophy generally identified as self-help. Lee was a successful insurance executive and a proud businessman. His path crossed with a Reverend Sutton Griggs, who epitomized those blacks who were aggressively pursuing integration, which was seen as the most practical road to progress. Griggs was one of the early concoctors of visionary, sometimes crackpot, social problems intended to solve the race problem, which were outlined in several books he authored. Along with other black church ministers, he formed something called the Interracial League, which of course turned out to have an all-black membership. Some satirized it as Lily Black Interracial League. Griggs and his cohorts were accused of courting white approval and philanthropy, especially philanthropy. George Lee was mortified by those blacks who sought after what he called patronizing white generosity and claimed that Sutton sought only to win white funds and friends. Lee blamed the weaknesses of the racist economic and social position on interracial backdoor diplomats and pussyfoots like Griggs. In a journal article by David Tucker, Black Pride in Negro Business in the 1920s, Lee is described as adamantly opposed to Griggs and his integrationist philosophy. Tucker writes, George Lee feared the Reverend and his league conceded too much in seeking white sympathy. Lee complained about the race being burdened with 40,000 ministers who were busily teaching blacks to depend on God, while little if anything else was being done to teach the Negro to depend on himself. The only means of winning the approval of the white community and advancing the cause of the race, insisted Lee, was an intelligent exercise of citizenship rights, buying homes, buying farms, building business, and producing wealth. All these things Lee is talking about independence and ownership. He claimed that if problem solvers such as Griggs and other interracial exponents would simply leave Negro businessmen alone, the race could develop its own community and help to make the South blossom like a rose. And even when black businesses in Memphis suffered serious setbacks after the failure of the fraternal insolvent savings bank due to dishonest black bank officers, Lee kept the faith. Could Memphis Negroes, who he considered the most advanced in the South, turn back? Never. We must step forward and build upon the ashes of the ruins. To turn back means disintegration and economic slavery. I think we're still showing a whole bunch of that economic slavery today. We have a lot of blacks who are making a lot of money in the entertainment industry. We have a lot of blacks who are making a lot of money in the athletic industry, but they're not actually putting a lot of their resources back into uplifting the community either. The day the doors were shut at the solvent bank, Lee was already up and eager to establish a new bank. See, this guy's already thinking about a new bank. He's already got a vision. He's not letting one setback hold him down. What should the black man do? He rhetorically asked. He must do as the white man, that is, send his criminals to jail and then build anew. We don't send our criminals to jail. We send them to Congress. Crookedness is not a racial trait, he declared. Main Street has been sending her white crooks to the penitentiary for years. Beale Street must do the same and then march on with confidence in our race and in our God. Tucker describes Lee as an outstanding example of that era spirit of self-help and rights, Negro capitalists of the 1920s did much more than seek personal gain, providing, as they did, the real cutting edge of Negro protest. In Memphis, the businessman contributed the most aggressive local leadership and provided a militant philosophy of black pride. Alan Speer in Black Chicago adds, the doctrine of self-help, although prominent in the development of Negro social service institutions, was above all a business philosophy. Its leading exponents were businessmen, and it constantly emphasized the importance of Negro business enterprises in increasing the influence and self-respect of the Negro community. And the only thing we see being created in the Negro community today, fast food restaurants, hair weave places, and fried chicken places, and then none of these are owned by black people. You got foreigners selling us fake hair. You got foreigners selling us fried chicken because they know that's what we like to eat. Men like George Lee, Robert Boyd, and Richard R. Wright often use the term progressive in describing themselves as others who shared their views. For them, the term was tied to particular notions about the advancement of blacks. Those who failed to understand the central role of money and the need for wealth accumulation to bring about greater freedom were looked upon these men as backward thinkers or unprogressive. A progressive was one who worked at creating capital. For many years, battles like the one between George Lee and Sutton Griggs were commonplace in black communities around the country. And look at what we're being taught today, what we're being told today. You know, our congressmen and our so-called black leaders. Isn't it amazing that no other race or culture in this country has anybody they would identify as a leader? Why do black people need someone else to lead them? But they're discrediting business ownership and talking about we're still dependent. By 1944, there was not one black-owned bank in Chicago. A Defender editorial entitled "We Need Banks" lamented the fact that in Chicago, with approximately 300,000 Negroes, there is not a single bank owned by them. I live here in the Houston, Texas area. How many banks you know that are owned by blacks are even in this area? The writer rejected excuses about bank failures during the Depression. Oh, and by the way, answer to that question, I believe it's only one. White businessmen had the courage to reinvest and bounce back, he claimed. And all we do is groan and complain because other racial groups with more money for capital move into our areas and gobble up opportunities for new ventures. I just talked about that. We have the men with money. There is certainly the need. There is only one question. Do our men with means have the courage, imagination, and vision to pool their resources to create this necessary institution? Once again, here in Houston, if you go to a certain part of town on the southwestern side, you'll see what we call Chinatown. And they have so much economic clout that they actually change the names of the streets to represent their culture. The consequences of the Depression made it harder for the proponents of self-help to make their case. What chance do they now stand against those who are urging blacks to cease initiating their own ventures and work for further integration into white institutions? In an interview, the late writer Vincent Baker, who had actively participated in the civil rights movement, reflected on the Depression as a turning point. He claimed that as New Deal policies, New Deal, and what we're experiencing right now from the government is the New Deal. As New Deal policies were put into effect to cope with the devastation caused by the Depression, this increased the role of government in the life of the average person. Gradually, the American mindset began to adapt to this growing presence in their lives. I mean, we've totally accepted the government present in our lives now. The new circumstances proved especially injurious to blacks, since there were now no leaders to signal an alarm and warn of the inevitable increased dependence on whites. If anything, said Baker, the projected agendas and policies being drawn up in Washington fit right in with the preachments of the leaders who began to emerge in the 1940s. One legacy of the 1930s catastrophe was a defeatism which grew among the most influential blacks. This defeatist spirit was augmented by a growing band of black intellectuals who publicly disparaged self-help efforts. And I mean, we keep hearing it over and over again. Larry Elder has termed it called Victocrat. But we've gotten away from self-help, and people keep telling us we're victims. In the pages of their academic publications, they made fun of the small black businesses that once dotted the landscape of every black community and found no virtue in them. Puny was a favorite term these elites like to apply when comparing black efforts to the Mammoth, Sears, Roebuck, or Ford Motor Company. The leading black sociologist of the time, E. Franklin Frazier, led the assault on the entrepreneurial past and downplayed the importance of black business because, as he claimed, the profits of these enterprises did not compare to those of large-scale operations. And see, what we need to think about, these large operations that are operating in this country now started out as small enterprises. And Marcus Garvey said that that's the problem with the Negro. The Negro wants to start at the top. He doesn't want to put the work in like other people have. It now became fashionable to deride the teachings of people like Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee elders. In fact, such teachings were soon wiped clear from the history textbooks. I mean, it's pretty hard to find a whole bunch of history now in any book. I mean, they've taken the Constitution away. They don't teach that in school anymore. And I mean, nobody's teaching you to go to school, get a good education so you can start a business. What kind of thinking is that? This educated intellectual class of blacks now taught that the poor have no bootstraps, thus reinforcing notions that leaders in an early age vigorously fought against. David Tucker captured the truth when he wrote in 1969, "Black capitalism suffered a drastic loss of prestige in the 1930s when the economic depression led the race intellectuals to initiate an anti-business tradition which has continued into the present." And I mean, we're talking about 1969, and look at what mentality we have in our community now. We're still not thinking about starting business. And I mean, a lot of people get upset, but as I just recently mentioned, we ran to the government for an affirmative action program, and if you really wanted to be equal, why did our so-called leaders and our civil rights establishment say, well, if you really want to make the playing field equal for us, offer us 50% of the government contracts, not 10%. And now today, we have a lot of black people who look down on network marketing businesses because they don't consider them a traditional business, where you have to go spend a whole lot of money on real estate and employees and insurance and all these other things. But network marketing businesses are the best affirmative action program ever produced in this country. Issues that were once debated among blacks were no longer open for debate. We see that now. If you don't think the way most blacks think, they ignore you, call you crazy, or say you're a nut job. Or then they want to call you Uncle Tom, and they don't even understand who Uncle Tom was. Now the advocates of economic independence were downgraded and ostracized. Still dealing with that today. While integrationist forces, subsidized by wealthy whites, grew stronger. The era of the NAACP had begun. And right now, when we look at the NAACP, they support an organization like Planned Parenthood, whose founder was all about destroying the black race because she considered them inferior. And now, of the 55 million babies who have been aborted since 1973, over 38% of them have been black. Men like William Pettiford, John Whitelaw Lewis, Jesse Binger, and Richard R. Wright proved their mettle by their willingness to become active participants in America's economic system, while providing resources for thousands of blacks to uplift their families out of the reaches of poverty. And that's the only way we're going to uplift ourselves out of poverty, is to go into business for ourselves. We're taught in school that, if you get an F, you're failing. So failing is looked down on, and anytime you do anything in life that's worthwhile, you're going to have to fall. You think about when we were toddlers first learning how to walk, and we fell down, our parents never told us to stay down there. They said, get back up, you can do it again. So failure is going to be always a part of success. And so we need to become active participants in our economic capitalist system in the United States of America. The only way you're going to really participate fully is to go into business for yourself. You can't continue to operate from a position of lack if you plan on getting on top of this system. And see, part of our problem, we keep running to our politicians and asking them to change the system. And our politicians will listen to us and they'll, you know, say what they think you want to hear, and tickle your ears with these feel-good statements, and then they're trying to advance the race. They're trying to stay employed. And, you know, they have a salary for life once they get elected to Congress. And so we can't go to them and try to influence them if we don't have economics. We need economics to influence them. We have to stop doing it backwards. We're trying to influence them without economics.